Continuing the roundworm chapter, this kind of gives you an idea of how unimportant whoever put this stuff together considered roundworms, because these are a bunch of phyla. Remember I said there's a lot of little phyla? These are a bunch of the other phyla. When you looked at pond water, you may have seen these guys swimming around, rotifers, little bitty guys, only one opening in their digestive system, but tiny with full functioning nervous system and such. Found all over the world, almost exclusively in freshwater, but there's less than 4,000 species. It's just they're found everywhere, but they're not considered terribly important. They're important in the lower level food chain. And then nematomorphs, what they call horsehair worms, and these guys are even rarer. Here's nematodes. For the cross section, there's the worm. And now we're going to talk about various roundworm parasites that are fairly important one way or another, even to us. Dracunculus have been known as guinea worms. Guinea often was used as a referral to the Mediterranean area. When I was a kid, it was a bad word that you would use to refer to Italians or Greek people. I don't think anybody uses it that way anymore. But if they do, I apologize for speaking the word, but that's what they used to be called. Dracunculus is the genus name, but that's the way it's known. I don't even tell you the truth, remember the whole species name. And these are parasites they tend to be found in very dry areas, which makes it tricky to get your offspring to the next host. Remember, that's a parasite's whole job, is to get into a host, reproduce before they get dealt with in one way or another, and then get offspring on to the next host. With Dracunculus, they do this in a very unusual way. You pick them up in drinking water. They're actually in little tiny Dracunculus larvae have gotten into things like the rotifers, or mostly little crustaceans though. Little tiny crustaceans that if you held it up to the light, with a glass bottle, you could probably see them swimming around. We'll actually hopefully look at them in the lab, Daphnia and things like that. But very commonly a contaminant in open water. So you go and you fill your water jug and you take it home and you drink the water and you drink these little bitty crustaceans and they die. You digest them, but then the larval worms come out and they don't stay in your digestive system. They bore out of your digestive system and settle around your intestine. So there's a lot of food there, and they can get pretty decent size. If you've ever pulled the ink cartridge out of a ballpoint pen, long and skinny, out of a big pen or a ballpoint pen, that's about how big around these worms get. The females can get fairly long though. They can get up to foot and a half long. You need to get males out. These are separate males and females. And then they need to find each other and mate. When the female is ready to lay her eggs, she migrates away from your intestines. So she gets out underneath your skin into the loose connective tissue that holds your skin down. Not that loose, she has to push her way through it. And she works down towards your feet. You can see her under the skin. You can see this worm working its way, and your immune system can't really do anything about it because she's way too big, but it's still trying. So you get inflammation and you get red, and it's really painful. And this infestation is actually described in the Bible when they describe it as burning serpents or fiery serpents. Remember, anything long and skinny was, classified in the same group with snakes, so that's why it's translated that way. But you can see descriptions of this in the Bible. And so these have been inflicting people around the Mediterranean for a really, really long time. Now they're not a big problem because if you take your water into your house and just pour it through a decent cloth, it catches the crustaceans, and then you hang the cloth out to dry, and it kills them, kills the worms. And that's been a very effective way of getting rid of these guys. So these don't tend to be a major health problem anymore. So why am I talking about them? Because in ancient times, people who were doctors couldn't do a lot for you, right? Is a lot of old treatments, didn't do anything but give you a placebo effect. Maybe it soothed, pain. Is a poultice could actually have fought infections if there's reasons for that. I don't really want to get into it. But these were something that you could go to the doctor for. And he'd look and go, yeah, you got one of those. I don't know what they call them. He said, okay, sit here. And you'd sit down, and the little worm, by this point, because this is what the female's trying to do. So she's moved down below your knees. And the next time you go to get water, you take your water jugs and you walk into the water to fill your water jugs. You go to the local oasis or the local river or whatever. And when your leg gets wet, temperature drops pretty around your skin. That's her cue. She sticks herself out and starts to lay eggs into the water. Then the larvae will hatch and get into the crustaceans and go on to the next host. So you sit in the doctor's house and he pours water on your leg. And then the female sticks out to lay her eggs. Now he's got a little stick with a slot cut in the end and a little crossbar on it. And so she sticks out and he catches her on the little slot. And then he starts to use the crossbar and wind her up and get her out, pull her out of your skin. Sometimes it gets kind of tight. And he'll go, nah, okay, come back in a couple of days. And so you're walking around with this worm, sometimes with the stick still attached. And then you come back, and by that point, she's, the outer part is dried out. She's died. She's easier to get out because you don't want to break her off. That could be dangerous. So this was your typical doctor apparatus. With a worm on it. And keep in mind, the same way as the Genesis and the Bible put everything together that was kind of similar function, similar shape, they thought these were little snakes. So when they drew pictures of this, they drew them, with little snake tongues and stuff. And sometimes they got fancy. They put two snakes on the stick, and they often put wings on it because this became the symbol of Hermes, who was the patron god of doctors. And he had wings on his ankles so he could fly through the air. So you see fancy versions of this, but this is called a caduceus. Oops, so what if I could spell? And it would hang outside the doctor's house so you knew who a doctor was. This is the medical symbol. It became the medical symbol, and it's still on people's badges, right? This is the symbol that doctors you see on ambulances. This is the basic doctor symbol. It's a worm stick. A lot of doctors don't know this. I've actually been told that doctors don't like this idea, and they'll argue with you about it, some of them, but unfortunately, can't fight the facts. This is where the symbol came from, and it makes sense. You would symbolize something that the doctor could actually do for you that was actually a really effective treatment, and this was a very common parasite for a long time. So even though we've pretty much gotten it under control, the symbol is still around. Trichinella is a parasite of meat eaters. Is that if you eat some meat, what you may be eating is meat, and there's little bitty larval worms coiled up in the actual muscle. And when you eat them, You digest the muscle away from them. You free them from a little casing that they're in. And depending on how far along, they go through several stages. If they're at their very last stage, they'll turn into adults, and the females and the males will mate, and the larvae will invade you and embed in muscles all over your body, so that if you get eaten by another meat eater, they can spread. This is how they spread. This is a contaminant of predators and scavengers. So people that hunt what in parts of the world they call bushmeat, wild, like raccoons, bears, possums to some extent, rats. In some parts of the country, they catch and eat rats. Anything that would have already eaten meat and possibly picked these worms up. If you eat them, you can get infested with these worms, and a large immersion. If it invades a whole bunch of your muscles, it can be very, very serious. As you get your immune system goes nuts, it can be deadly. So trichinosis is a very dangerous thing. Now, for people that don't hunt, this also has been an issue in pigs, because when you raise pigs, if you've ever seen commercial hogs, they're big, nasty critters. And their enclosures attract, because there's a lot of food there, it attracts rats. Rats are scavengers, rats that also are out in the world scavenging carcasses and picking trichinella up. And a rat that doesn't quite get from one side of the pig enclosure to the other, because the hog goes, hump, pig will eat them. One bite, really. And so the pigs can get infected with trichinella worms. And this for a long time was why you always cooked pork until the meat was all the way cooked through. You didn't serve rare pork, because the only way to kill the worms was to cook them to death. And you needed the meat to be white for that. You're still eating dead worms, but this was actually discovered since your immune system can't really do anything about them. Once they're curled up in your muscles, they don't move. And one thing your immune system will do to something that's foreign, but is stationary, is they will seal them into a little clump of calcium. They'll basically build a tiny bit of bone around them. And it was, these guys were discovered by a butcher who realized that pork sounded different when he cut it than beef did. It was a really sharp knife, and he took home, he had a little homemade, little microscope at home, and he took really thin slices of meat, and he could see these little white dots in them, and he very carefully cracked one open and saw the worm come out. And that's how they discovered trichinella. Most of our pork in the supermarket comes from factory farms, which are nasty places, huge buildings with hundreds, if not thousands of pigs in very small, like cubicles, just kind of, they barely can turn around, if they can turn around. It's not a great way to raise animals, not great for the animals, but it tends to be a very controlled environment with no rats. So pigs are not typically infested with trichinella anymore. They have toxoplasmosis. I talked about that in an earlier chapter. For some reason, everybody, when they were trying to decide about what do we do, they forgot about toxoplasmosis. But there was an announcement a few years ago that pork is safe enough now, you can serve pink pork. Well, if you get it from a factory farm, sure. If you get it from locally sourced pork, which is better than ethically than getting the factory farm, can you be sure that those pigs have not scarfed up some rats in their little happy pig enclosure? I certainly couldn't. So if you have an opportunity to eat pork, don't let them serve it to you pink. Send it back, make them cook it through. They will argue with you. I've talked to many a manager, many a restaurant. I mean, toxoplasma alone is an issue, but trichinella, if they're using locally sourced, actually local farmers for their pigs, for their pork, still can be an issue. It's not really as under control as it's supposed to be. Hookworms. I just read an article about somebody who signed up for a test of a hookworm vaccine, and he actually had to be infected with hookworms. Hookworms for a long time was a major, major problem in the United States. It's a lot of parasites came with Europeans and Africans, and people came in, they brought parasites with them. If the parasites didn't require some sort of local host like the flatworms often did, then they could set up shop in the United States, and hookworms definitely did that. Your typical American hookworm, now dogs and cats get these too, but dogs and cats each have their own separate species. And cat hookworms don't like to live in people, or cats for that matter, and cat hookworms don't like to live in people or dogs. You'll see more crossover between dogs and cats than you will between humans and dogs and cats. But in humans, the hookworm species is called Necator americanus, which is Latin for American killer. Gives you an idea. Hookworms live in the digestive system. You pass the eggs hatch out in the world, and the larvae live out in the world for a while. Very, very tiny. And when it's wet enough, and they like it wet and warm, when it's wet and warm, they come up onto the surface and they crawl around on the surface. And if you are walking around in bare feet and they get onto the thinner part in your arch, they can't really come in through the pad where it's, if you're somebody who walks on bare feet a lot, is the pad of your foot is too thickened for them to come through. But they'll come through in the arch, or if they get up on the side, or if you sit down and you get them on your thigh, they'll come right in through your skin. This guy was actually administered hookworms where they had them on a patch, they put him on his arm, and they left him there, I think, for an hour or so, and when they took it off, it was just a red spot where they'd all gone in. Once they're in your system, they get into your circulation and they emerge in your lungs. Probably long, long ago they were lung parasites, but it's easier to get offspring out of your body in your digestive system than out of your lungs. So they come out in your lungs. If you pick up a whole bunch of them at once, that alone is dangerous, because you can have an inflammation and issues where your lungs fill up with fluid. But if you don't, die from that. The worms get into your mucus that you clear out dust with, and then they get into your digestive system. In your intestines, these guys are, fully grown, not real big, maybe an inch, inch and a half long, very, very thin. They call them hookworms because if you look at them under the microscope at their mouths, they have these 4 hooked teeth. I only got 3 fingers, but you get the basic idea. And they get up, they work their way through the mucus of your digestive system, and they bite into the lining, and they drink blood, which is another reason why it's almost certain they were lung parasites, because why drink blood in a place that's full of food? Well, if that's what you used to do in the lungs, that's what you're still doing in the digestive system. And a heavy infestation can make you anemic because they'll process blood. Turns out not to have a lot of nutrition to it. It's very dilute. So you got to process a lot of blood in order to get enough to live on if you're a worm. And so they can actually deplete your blood if you get a really heavy infestation. But the other issue too is they don't stay in the same spot. They bite and feed for a while, they let loose and they go somewhere else. And there are times where your digestion digests away that little hole they left. And you can actually perforate your intestines, which is really life-threatening. So there's a whole bunch of ways that they are dangerous. And while they're in there, they lay eggs, and the eggs pass out of your body. These have mostly been controlled by controlling human waste, right? If in the old days in the South, people working in the fields, when they had to go, they would go off to the edge and they would just go. There were no like latrines or porta potties or anything. And so a lot of stuff, it spread the larvae. When they discovered how the worms worked, some of the southern states, it's like the 1870s, 1880s, put a whole bunch of government money into sanitation, into sewer systems, and basically bathrooms, and that got hookworms largely under control in the United States. There's still a problem in many places in the world, but in the United States they haven't been an issue for a little over 100 years. You can occasionally pick up dog and cat hookworm larvae, where you get them on your hand, they come in through your skin, and they can't get very far. They crawl around under the skin, but they're not really compatible with your system. But your immune system goes, yeah, and you can get this nasty bubbly rash from having them wandering, and when they die under there. And it's a disease with a great name. It's called creeping eruption. And again, they don't go through the whole life cycle that they would if they were human hookworms, but they can be, fairly nasty. Yep, I should have underlined that. These are genuses. Genuses are considered foreign. Ascaris, I've heard it called Ascaris. These are fairly big. This is a bottle of these guys. I don't know how well the light's coming through. Let me put this in the light. It looks like a bottle full of night crawlers, white night crawlers. So, pretty big, about the size of a big earthworm. These also live in your digestive system. Eggs pass with fecal material. In a dry environment, these like it warm and dry. In a dry environment, long after the fecal material has all kind of become part of the environment, the eggs can last. In some environments, they can last for years. And so they get into the next host by just being picked up in the dirt. You inadvertently get dirt with eggs in it into your mouth, and you swallow them, and they hatch, and you get these worms. Worms are fairly big. They don't control their infestation. If you get a whole bunch of them, it can actually clog your system up. And one of the issues you get is that the female is long and fairly pointy on both ends. The male's a little bit shorter, and his tail is hooked like an old-fashioned umbrella handle. Why? Well, the female has her opening to her reproductive system about halfway along her body. And when she gets ready to mate, she goes looking for a male. Now keep in mind, unless you've installed interior lighting or they have flashlights, it's dark in there. So everything they do by feel. So she's feeling for a little male worm. She's feeling for the hook, basically. And sometimes they get confused because they're worms, they're not the brightest animals in the world. And there's openings from your liver and your pancreas that bring digestive enzymes and bile in. Sometimes they'll get in there and they go, oh, this feels like a male, and they get in and then they get stuck. Nothing's getting past them. So the same way that a gallstone can block your bile is that you don't really get pancreatic stones. It's a big deal, is that you're not getting digestive enzymes or bile into your intestines. That's a big deal. Now, being big worms with some power, they can also push their ways through some of the valves that we use to separate parts of our digestive system. And there's a picture linked in the book where this person's got them hanging out of their nose. Females actually work their way up to here and is going, any guys out here? That's a nasty way to wake up in the middle of the night. And the lab that I worked in Memphis, we had a couple in bottles that had come in that had been discovered in a baby's diaper because they'd gone out the other end. Can you imagine, opening a diaper and in the stuff that you expect is this long, live white worm going, any guys? So that's not dangerous, but it's pretty alarming. It's actually hard to treat them if you have a heavy infestation. You can kill the worms, but they often clog as you try to get them out through they jam up like an old-fashioned log jam. And sometimes you need to go in and remove them surgically, even though they're dead. So Ascaris can be fairly dangerous. Not really a big deal in the United States much. Down south, they do exist. Sometimes the larvae will wander through your body, and that can be dangerous. But around here, you don't tend to find them. What you do find around here are pinworms. Pinworms, by far the most common worm in humans in the United States. Probably are not parasites. They live in your large intestine, where they're probably eating your little buddy bacteria and other bacteria that live in your large intestine. They're probably not taking anything from you that you really would otherwise use, which means they're not really parasites. But, and they live in a part of your intestine that isn't really very food rich, unless you can eat bacteria. Very, very tiny worms. You can build up a decent population of them. When the females have mated and are ready to lay eggs, they will migrate south. Your large intestine is about 3-4 feet long. They tend to live in the front end of it. They need to get to the back end of it because she's going out. Is that she tends to move most easily when everything's kind of calm. So when you're sleeping, they tend to migrate. And then by the time you're about ready to get up in the morning, they have come out your back end because they can get out through the valve. And what she does, she crawls across your skin and leaves a trail of eggs behind her. The eggs are super tiny. Is once the little liquid that comes out with them dries out, they just go through the air. They can go through clothing. They can go through a vacuum cleaner filter, and they spread all over the place that way. And you pick the eggs up, and then you get pinworms. It's generally considered a child disease because two things. All of the nerves on your surface have been there since you were a kid. But when you were a kid, they were closer together. So your skin was more sensitive when you were little because your touch receptors were closer together. And these worms come out and they're crawling across your skin. And they make your skin itch. It happens in adults too, but in kids, more noticeable. And in kids, when their butts itch, they're more likely to scratch at them in the presence of other people, especially adults. So this is something you see in daycare, where the kids coming through daycare, they're digging at their butt, because their butt itches, and she's like, "What's the problem?" It itches. And then you call the doctor, and the doctor goes, "Do the Scotch tape test." When your kid wakes up in the morning, flip them over, pull their pants down, take a piece of Scotch tape, stick it around their little butthole, and then bring us the tape. And they look on the tape for worms and eggs. That tells you you have pinworms. Now everybody in the house has got those pinworms. This, possibly as much as 75% of the people in the United States are carrying pinworms. I've seen every estimate from 75 down to about 18%. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. They're more common in upper class people than lower class people. Take a guess at that one. But they're fairly benign. They don't really do much of anything to you, except people don't like the idea that they have these little worms in them. But they're our buddies. Is that they? And I know this is getting long, but I want to fit this last one in. There's several different species of roundworms that are called filarial worms, and they use a vector a vector host that is a flying insect, usually a biting flying insect. There's a type of filarial worm that causes what's called river blindness, where they're picked up by bugs that breed in slow-flowing water. So if you live near a river, not a little stream, not a pond, a river, then these bugs are around, and they carry the worms, so they get into you when the bugs bite you. And these little guys just wander through all your tissues. And they like to, for some reason nobody really understands, they like to wander through your eyes. And after you've had them for a bunch of years, they do damage, and they can make you blind. So they call it river blindness. And in some areas of Africa, there's whole villages, virtually everybody above a certain age, their sight is compromised, a lot of them to the point where they can't see at all. Obviously, this has huge economic impact. Those filarial worms are pretty high on the list for the World Health Organization. Let's get rid of these guys. And then there are other ones that clog your drainage system. There turns out there's a bunch of these. We do have a local filarial worm, but it is not a human parasite. But we're paying for it, some of us. I'm paying for it because once a month I have to give our dogs heartworm pills. Heartworms are carried by mosquitoes. They get into the dog's circulatory system, and bizarrely, they like to live in the chambers and the outflow of the heart. It's like if you're going to live in the stream, you're going to live in the rapids. It's odd, but that's what they do. And they, of course, a lot of them get swept away, and they clog up the blood vessels that they're going to from the right side of the heart into the lungs. and they can cause congestive heart failure. They can also, the backup can cause the heart to enlarge. They can be pretty dangerous over a long period of exposure for dogs. So you give them pills. You have to test them first, because if they have a bunch of heartworms, you don't just give them the pills, because it'll kill the heartworms, and they'll, in one mass sweep into the lungs and cause major problems. You have to kind of ease them into it, or start them young when they haven't really accumulated, a population that's dangerous. So around here, those are our filarial worms. There's been almost no recorded cases of heartworms living in people. They don't even particularly like cats. Every once in a while you'll see a case of it in cats, but it's canids, dogs, foxes, coyotes. So around here, even if we could treat all the dogs, there's what they call reservoir hosts, wild hosts that support the same parasite, where it can come back into the domestic hosts. Okay, that's it for all of the roundworm parasites. I'm getting itchy myself. And so that's it for the chapter.